So thank you everybody for taking some time today to join the webinar. This is Managed Metadata 101, Taxonomies and Tagging in SharePoint. My name is Mark Lair. I'll be your presenter today. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at WAND. I have been in the taxonomy world for the last 15 years. I've built a large number of taxonomies. I've worked with clients to customize taxonomies specifically for their organization, and I have quite a bit of experience in the SharePoint space, and that's what I want to share with you a little bit today. A little bit about WAND. We are a company based in Denver, Colorado, and we've been building taxonomies since 1983. Our approach is that we help our clients develop specific taxonomies more quickly by providing access to a library of predefined taxonomies covering most industries and business topics. So instead of starting from scratch, clients can access our predefined libraries and then customize them to make them specific for their particular organization. We also have a taxonomy professional services group, and we have a client base ranging from, of course, SharePoint clients to online yellow pages to e-commerce, enterprise search, and we work with companies with as few as 5 or 10 people all the way up to Fortune 50 clients. Brief look at just some of the taxonomies WAND has in our library. We have taxonomies for business functions as well as for specific industry vertical segments. But this webinar is designed to be educational about SharePoint, so we're not going to get too much into WAND. If you are interested in seeing any of our taxonomies or our taxonomy library portal, you'll have a chance after the webinar to request a contact and we can set up a demo. But otherwise, the purpose of the webinar today is to learn about how do we use taxonomy in SharePoint. So as our agenda, we're going to start off just defining what a taxonomy is and how you might use it. I'm going to briefly talk about what is tagging. Those are a couple of terms we're going to be using quite a bit today. Walk through a few slides about why use managed metadata at all. What's the value of this inside of SharePoint? And then we're going to go into a demo. Most of this is going to be sort of workshop demo. We're going to look at the term store, how to use it, how to build a taxonomy, how to tag documents within SharePoint, and then once you've actually tagged content, what can you do with it on the search and the filtering side. We will do a quick 30-second commercial for the WAND Taxonomy Library portal just to show you how that works, but then we'll wrap up with how do you actually get started in your organization, what are some things you should think about, and then we'll take questions. Again, like I said, if you do have questions, please put them into the GoToWebinar panel on the right, and we'll address those at the end. So what actually is a taxonomy? That's a jargony word. I think it's getting more common, which is nice to see. Probably everyone who first hears taxonomy, you like to make the joke, oh, is that like stuffing animal heads, like taxidermy? So that's a pretty standard one. If you thought of that, give yourself a pat on the back. But what a taxonomy actually is, for the purpose of our discussion, is a taxonomy is a collection of concepts around a given subject domain that have been organized into a hierarchical tree structure. When I say concepts, you might hear them called categories or terms or preferred terms. And on the right, we can see a brief example of a taxonomy for human resources. And you can see a lot of important concepts that you may want to tag documents or content with in SharePoint, things like relocation policy, gift policy, company handbooks. So all those concepts are taken and which are essentially creating as a common vocabulary that everyone in your organization can use to talk about human resources topics. And that's going to help when people are organizing content, make sure everyone is using the same language. You can also see it's organized into a hierarchical structure. So instead of having a list of 1,000 HR terms and a flat list that you would scroll through, we try to put some tree organization structure around it so people can actually know that here's all the policies go together and everything related to personnel files are over here, just simply for ease of use purposes. But probably the most important thing when we're thinking about taxonomy in SharePoint is the taxonomy that you're building. All these concepts are going to be potential metadata values that could be tagged to documents. Another example of a taxonomy, just to walk through the basic elements that we're going to see in SharePoint. On the right, with the finance and investment taxonomy. And the SharePoint Taxonomy Manager, or the Term Store, keeps things pretty simple. So you have a basic tree structure where you have a concept or a preferred term. In this case, for the example, we'll look at foreign exchange. And foreign exchange has a broader term of asset type because a foreign exchange is a type of asset in the investment construct. There are narrower types or more specific types of foreign exchange, such as Australian dollar. So again, you can see how we can drill in using the hierarchy from a broad concept of asset type down to foreign exchange, down to Australian dollar. And the last really element that you should be aware of around taxonomies for SharePoint are synonyms or other labels, as SharePoint will call them, and we'll look at. In this case, foreign currencies is a synonym for foreign exchange. We might also have FX. This is important so that when users are doing tagging, if I think of the concept of foreign exchange as FX and I begin to type that in, if you have it as a synonym, that synonym will direct the user to your preferred concept or your default concept of foreign exchange. Again, when we think of taxonomy as the idea of a common language for the organization to use, you want to account for variants or other ways of expressing that concept that other people might think to use and make sure that they're directed to the preferred concept. So as another example, you can imagine if someone comes in and they have an HR document and your preferred term is human resources and they just type in HR, if they don't find anything, they're going to think that's weird, we don't have that concept. But if you have it as a synonym, it will say, oh, HR, we actually call it human resources, and that will sort of resolve the query or resolve the users, point them to the correct tag. So I've used the term tag and tagging quite a bit already, so let's go ahead and define that as well. What do we mean by tagging? And tagging simply means applying metadata to documents. And I think everyone's tagged a picture on Facebook or Instagram or social media or a LinkedIn post. And it's trying to put some subject around what is this document or this post or this piece of content. So again, tagging is applying metadata to documents. I like to define two different types of metadata. And the first we're going to think about is called just administrative metadata when we think about documents. And that's going to be things like modified date, author, file type, file size. Basically anything that if you go into a Word document on your desktop and you right click and go to view properties, those are all administrative metadata, the things that are already filled out. And administrative metadata is super easy to get because the computer usually applies it automatically. Unfortunately, it's not particularly useful for search. Nobody really wants to search for documents, Word documents that are 50 kilobit in size. Instead, people want to look for documents based on their subject. So that's where the other category of metadata comes in, which is what I call descriptive metadata or subject metadata, which I'll define as one or multiple words about the content of the document. So what's the subject of this document? So that if someone is doing a query, they can use it as a refiner, or if they're browsing through a list, they can quickly eyeball it and see, oh, this document is about human resources, this document's about finance, this is a gift policy, et cetera, et cetera. So really the taxonomy is going to be, as I mentioned, potential metadata values, and it's really potential descriptive metadata values. And the process of tagging is taking those descriptive metadata values, or those taxonomy values you've defined, and applying them to the appropriate document. Once you've done that, the tags that are applied to documents are going to be able to be used as search refiners, as library filters. They can power dynamic content web parts on SharePoint pages. They can be used for the content organizer, so you can drop documents off and have it routed to the appropriate location based on the metadata. So there's all sorts of great things you can do with metadata in SharePoint, and it's the taxonomy and those taxonomy-based tags, which is going to be the foundation for all of that. So we like to say that it really is a foundation for quality information governance in SharePoint. And hopefully if you're here today, that might mean you want to improve the information governance in SharePoint or make it easier for your users to find content. That kind of brings us to, we've defined taxonomy and tagging. Now, why do we care about this in SharePoint? And Wand has been doing taxonomy in SharePoint all the way since SharePoint 2010 first came out, which was 8 or 9 years ago. And SharePoint 2010 was the first version of SharePoint to have the term store. So we've spoken to thousands of companies. We have a free taxonomy download that many of you have gotten, the general business taxonomy. That's free for users of SharePoint. Thousands of companies have downloaded. And in talking to a lot of these companies, we hear a lot of the same challenges again and again. And a big piece is users just want better findability in SharePoint. And that's been a long-term challenge. Companies are getting better and better at it each year, but users still want to be able to find content more easily. The term store and then taxonomy and metadata in SharePoint are features that are designed to help alleviate that problem and to help, again, provide a backbone of metadata that can be used to make content more usable. But a lot of companies don't have a taxonomy, or they don't have that inside their organization. So it'd be great to use it, but they don't know where to start. And we usually, really don't see that companies, except for the largest companies, have library scientists on staff or have developed taxonomies. The last thing we see a lot is people are sort of drawn to using folder structures. That's what they're used to. They might be migrating some shared drives or some old SharePoint content that was organized in folders, and they're moving it in. But what they find out is that folders are pretty good for physical documents, like what I have in my file cabinet here in my office. But for digital content, folders really aren't very good. And moving to a metadata structure gives you much more flexibility in the ways that you can search or browse through that content. So companies have these challenges. We're hearing about them every day. But these are a few slides I wanted to share from a study from FindWise, which is a European enterprise search consultancy. They do a report every year, Enterprise Search and Findability Survey. And it's really great content. It gives us a window into what other organizations are doing. And you can see here from 2012 all the way through 2016, basically each year there's an upward trend towards companies, organizations using taxonomies to organize and classify content. So this kind of indicates the fact that people do have these challenges, and taxonomy actually is a solution. Companies are deploying this. The more data we have, the more we need to organize it. So it is something that works. Information findability is really important. What this chart speaks to, it's asking companies, what percentage or proportion of your employees need the ability to find information to do their job every day. And you can see that it's about 66% of the organizations, or 2/3 of the organizations, say either more than half or more than 3/4 of our employees need to be able to find information to do their job. So improving search and findability, maybe it's not the most exciting thing, but it's super important, and organizations realize that. The last little slide I picked out, it's asking what information areas are most important, and you can see the top 3. One is subject matter areas or knowledge areas. Number 3 is processes. And both of those things are sort of areas that we can capture with taxonomy terms. So we can have taxonomy concepts about our processes. We can have taxonomy concepts about subject matter areas. And then the second one's really interesting as well. When we talk about people, 60% of the people of the survey respondents want to be able to really find expertise or people in their organization. And taxonomy can be used to tag people as well. My site's profiles, Delves, really, etc. Companies can use the same taxonomies that they are using, that they've defined to organize documents, to also tag people, because a lot of times these topics are also skills. Who's got expertise in our company? Gift policy. Oh, that's Janet over in HR, and I can search for that and find her and ask her a specific question. So what's really interesting, I think, is the top 3 responses on this particular question are all things that really are powerfully driven by taxonomy. So just to summarize, and this will be our last slide before we jump into the demo, which I think people enjoy a little bit more. Why taxonomy for SharePoint? And number one is that documents often just don't have that appropriate subject-driven metadata. And it was unsupported in earlier versions of SharePoint. It's not easy to do if we're looking at shared drives. So as we migrate this content forward, if it's not something we've tackled before, now's really the time to do it. Because that content doesn't have good metadata, users just have an overall dissatisfaction with search. It's something that certainly is improving, but taxonomy can really give that strong foundation. And last, this is the big thing. I think well-tagged content in SharePoint opens doors to all sorts of to a superior SharePoint experience. There's a number of features that are driven by good metadata, such as, again, the metadata-based refiners, both in the search and within the document libraries themselves. Dynamic content web parts, so I can display content on a page dynamically based upon what it was tagged with. Gives a lot of flexibility in how you can use your content. The metadata-driven content organizer, so I can have a single drop-off point and based on the tags, again, route it to the appropriate location in SharePoint. Just to name a few. With that, let's go take a look at SharePoint. So first thing we're going to do is take a look at a demonstration of the term store. Now, the feature in SharePoint that allows us to use taxonomy is called the Managed Metadata Service. And the user interface, or the taxonomy manager associated with the Managed Metadata Service, is called the term store. And the term store can be accessed from site settings, or probably more appropriately from the central admin if you're on premise, or this demo is going to be in Office 365. So I'm going to go to the admin center for SharePoint. When I get to this SharePoint admin center on the left, we will see an option for the term store. So you're going to click on the term store. And here we are in the term store. And the way the term store is set up is that your taxonomies are going to be organized on the left-hand side in this left column. And on the right-hand side, depending on where you are in this structure, you're going to have a few different options. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through all the different options in the term store and how to use it. And we're going to start at the very top. First of all, one thing to know, for some reason I don't find this search to be super intuitive that it's there, so I always like to point it out. You can do a search at the very top that allows you to search through all the taxonomies that you have loaded in. It's just going to do sort of an autocomplete type search. So if you're not sure what concept you're looking for, you can start there. Next down, you just see the various languages that are turned on. Most organizations just are going to have a single language, but if you want to view it in a different language, you can toggle it there. But the most of the work is going to be done in this little lower section, and where you'll start off at the top is this house icon, and that's kind of your core term store at the top level. And if we go over to the right, you're going to see there's a general tab of options. And the first is you can choose which metadata application or which term store you want to see in this view on the left. Traditionally, we really don't see companies having more than one, but you should be aware that Microsoft has recently, this summer, released a hybrid taxonomy experience. So that's where this feature will come more into play. So what the hybrid taxonomy experience does, it allows you to keep taxonomy synchronized between your cloud or your Office 365 term store and your on-premise term store. And the way it works is that you migrate all your taxonomies to your cloud term store. And then the on-premise term stores are going to, for lack of a better term, subscribe to that cloud term store, and the taxonomies you have in the cloud will publish down to the on-premise term store. So that's where this dropdown will probably become more important for those with the hybrid instance. And that's going to be available for 2016 and I believe also 2013. Next down is the sample import. So this is a good link to be aware of if you want to create a taxonomy yourself, but you want to do it in Excel. You can start with this taxonomy sample import file, and it'll give you the form that you need to bring it back into the term store. I will note that any taxonomies you download from WAND are provided in this format, so they can easily be imported into the term store. Next down is your term store administrators. So these are users, and we'll get into the governance a little bit when we talk about term groups, which is next down. These are the users who can create the term groups and assign users to the group manager roles. Next is your default language. That's going to be the primary language that you create the taxonomy in. So I think every term that is created has to have a label in that default language. And then your next choice down is your working languages. And those, you may want to create your taxonomy in English, but have French translations, or Spanish. So those are going to be the other languages that you allow people to create taxonomies in. The working languages do not have to have a translation for every term. So that's the difference between default and working. The next level down, within your term store, there's going to be a variety of term groups. And you can see we have a few set up here. And a term group is essentially, the reason you need a term group is it allows you to control who can make changes to the taxonomies within those groups. So the groups are really the only construct for controlling who can manage which taxonomy. Our experience is most organizations don't have a large universe of people managing taxonomies, but if you did want to control it for any reason, you'd set up a group. You'd set up group managers, and the group managers can edit taxonomies, and they can also add group contributors. Next down is the contributor. The contributor can only edit the terms. They can't control who other contributors or managers are. So once we open up a group, we're going to see specific taxonomies, or term sets, as SharePoint refers to them. So here I have a few term sets set up, and if I click on the term set name, I'm going to get a few different options here. At the top is my term set name, so what do we call it? That's fairly self-explanatory. The second is the description. This is only going to be applicable to, I think it's only going to be seen for taxonomy managers. So this would be a good chance to say this is a term set of project management terms that we use for our project management group, and it's designed to tag documents, and it's not designed to do X, Y, Z. So that would just give a little context so everyone is on the same page of what this term set is used for. It's not really going to be shown to the end user. The owner or the primary user group, those are just going to be people who are sort of stakeholders, so to speak. And there's also stakeholders down below. But both of these, if you're going to make major changes to a term set, you may want to talk or ask the stakeholders or the owners. So this is just some kind of light governance purposes. The contact is just going to be an email address. So when people are tagging out in their document library, there may be an option for them to request a new term, and all that's going to do is just automatically open up an Outlook email and pre-populate it with this contact person. So nothing super sophisticated there, but if you want to have someone who's going to receive those taxonomy change requests, that would be the contact person. And then last is the submission policy. This is a pretty important one. I'd say the most important option for all the term set choices on this page. So there's two options, as you can see. The first is closed, and closed, as it's defined here, only metadata managers. So only someone who can come into the term store can make changes to the term set. If it's open, that means end users could actually add a new term when they're doing tagging. So we really encourage people to have a closed term set. If you keep a term set open, what you're going to see is that users will add all sorts of tags. They might add misspellings. The taxonomy will kind of become ungovernable. So it's best practice is to keep it closed and have a process where users can submit requests for new terms and then have a process for evaluating those terms. That's going to keep your taxonomy the cleanest moving forward. Few other options up here for a term set. Some of these are slightly outside of the scope of this webinar. We do have a recorded Manage Metadata 201 that digs into some of this stuff, and we may do a new edition shortly. But just to quickly talk about them, intended use, is it available for tagging or not? That's pretty important. If it's not checked, people can't use it. So you might want to keep it unchecked while you're building a taxonomy or when it's in draft form, but once it's published, you're going to want to check this box so people can use it. And then the next two choices are site navigation and faceted navigation. These are kind of advanced uses for taxonomy and for the term store. You can actually create a taxonomy that would power your entire site structure. So pages are created dynamically based on the taxonomy terms you have, instead of creating each of those pages individually. The menu is driven by the taxonomy you create. So those are some kind of advanced site architecture things you can do with the term store. Custom sort, I'm going to come back to this in a few moments. Custom properties, again, is kind of an advanced use, but it lets you store some additional data about a term set or about an individual term. The last one is a good one to be aware of. Translation will actually, if you want to go into a different language, you can use the Azure Translation Service, or you can create a translation export that will allow you to get a common translation format to send to a translator and then bring it back in. So if you're working in multiple languages, you should be aware of this translation tab. After the term set level or the taxonomy level, now we're getting into actual terms. So this is where the meat of the taxonomy development is going to take place. And what you can see is I've created a brief taxonomy for location. These little arrows can be expanded to show me the narrower terms. Here's North America. I can scroll down. The term store only allows you to see 10 terms at a time. So if you have a longer list, it's going to be driven by these arrows. You're going to page through. But I'm going to come down to Twin Cities. And now that we're on an individual term, we have a few more options that we can go through. And again, the first is it available for tagging? That's similar to the term set one, but it's actually a little more nuanced. You may want some terms might be useful for navigation purposes, but you don't want users to tag to them. So the example I'm going to go to later in my document library, and the reason I have a locations taxonomy, is that we have developed this example is that I have a document library of SharePoint event collateral. And one of the things I want to tag it with is where is that SharePoint event. So you can see this location taxonomy has the continents, and I have North America. But you know what? I really don't want people to tag to North America because that's not meaningful in the context of the SharePoint event. I really want them to get down to the specific city. So I'm going to come to North America and not make it available for tagging. That way, when people are tagging documents, which we'll look at, I'll show you later, you'll see that I can't choose North America. That's kind of pushing me down the taxonomy to a more specific term. So that's why that's a case where you may not want it available for tagging. Next is the language. It's going to start on your default language. If you're entering translations, you'd want to move it to the other language that you're doing. Here is a term description. This is actually a description that users will see, so it may be important if the concept is ambiguous to enter a description of it to help guide the user to what it means. In this case, I'm going to say Twin Cities combines Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota. So now if a user is mousing over that, which we'll look at later, they'll see this description. The default label is just the label that it's going to appear in as the tag. That's your preferred tag. That's the way you want it to show up in filters and etc. Other labels are the synonyms, and you can just enter synonyms like this. And now if anyone starts to type in St. Paul or Minneapolis or Mini, it's going to, we'll show you later, it's going to say, oh, we know what that means. We actually call it Twin Cities in our taxonomy. So we've made those changes, added a description, added some synonyms. I'm now going to hit save. That's an important thing to know about the term store. If you don't hit save, the changes you've made are actually not going to persist. So those are the various administrative options for the term set, the term store, the term groups, the term sets, and the terms themselves. Now we can actually make changes to the taxonomy, and the way you are going to make changes to the taxonomy in the term store is just by right-clicking. So here, Asia Pacific, I want to add a new term. When I right-click, we're going to get a variety of options. The first is create term. It's fairly self-explanatory. I'll add Hong Kong. Now that's a new term. You can right-click again. So a few other options. One, I can copy a term. That's going to create a new instance of Asia Pacific with a new unit in the database. It's going to make a duplicate copy, and I can move that elsewhere. I can copy a term with the children. That'll make a duplicate copy of the entire branch. I can reuse terms. So that's going to move the whole branch to a different term set, but it's going to keep the same unit in the database. Now we're getting a little bit of technical, but as you're building out your taxonomy governance, it's good to define how you're going to use these terms internally. And if I reuse terms, that allows me to make changes. I can add to that set in the other term set where I reuse it. And then I can pin terms. Again, like I said, this gets a little in the weeds. If I pin a term, it's going to move that term set or that group of terms to another term set where I can also use it, but I will not be able to make changes to the term set in that other location. So again, if I'm the controller of the locations for the organization, but another group wants to use those locations, if I don't want them to touch it, I'll allow them to pin it so they can kind of borrow but not have the permissions. Merging terms is going to combine two terms together, and you'll choose one to be the default and the other to be the label. This is pretty important if you're doing taxonomy cleanup. Maybe two terms were created that are actually the same, or if you're looking at keywords, which I'll look at in a second, you can bring that keyword into the taxonomy and combine it as a synonym. Deprecating a term. Deprecating a term is you're not deleting it, but you're saying we're not going to use it anymore. So let's say that there's no longer a SharePoint event in China. I might deprecate that term. And you can see if you don't save things, it doesn't like that. I might deprecate the term. So it's not deleted, but it's going to be grayed out and actually deprecated Asia Pacific by mistake. You can always re-enable it. So deprecating is a good process if you don't want it used again, but you don't quite want to delete it. You might want to preserve that. And then last, or not quite last, the next is you can move a term. That's pretty self-explanatory. You're actually going to take it from one location and put it in another spot, a different taxonomy. And finally, you can delete a term. So deleting, we generally would only use during initial taxonomy construction. Once content has been tagged with terms, it's better to deprecate. So the last thing I would note on the term store, all these taxonomies up here are managed terms, as called in SharePoint. And those are kind of formal terms that we've defined to be in our taxonomy. And the converse to that is managed keywords. We also have hashtags, and those are going to appear under the system group, kind of below the fold, below this little dashed line. And these are two different purposes. One is that hashtags are going to show up anywhere where someone's done a post and added a hashtag. So hashtags are sort of folksonomy. You don't really need to manage them. You cannot create a hierarchy to them. You can only delete or deprecate. Hashtag is a good place to look just to see what topics are people interested in. What are people tagging things with? Maybe you want to take a hashtag and maybe that concept should be added to a taxonomy as a preferred term. So just sort of a good source to look at things, see what concepts are hot and new. The second is keywords. Keywords are added from a variety of places. One, if you import content that already has tags associated to it, which is probably not going to be most things, but if you've added a tag to the properties panel in your Word document, that keyword would be imported here. If people, for older versions of SharePoint, are still using tags and notes, those will show up in the keywords. If you have opened up a column or created an enterprise keywords column and allowed people to add their own tags, those will show up here. So the keywords are, again, same as the hashtags, so it's a good thing to review on an ongoing basis to see what people are tagging. You can actually, unlike hashtags, you can actually promote the keywords. So I can move it up into one of these term sets, and then I could either make it its own term, or I could merge it with another term. So keywords might be a good source of new terms, new topics, new synonyms. Good idea to keep an eye on keywords. So we're going to now show you, we've looked at a few taxonomies. We're going to go into a document library and show how you would tag documents and how to actually use some of these taxonomies that we've created. So like I said, this is a document library, and my pretend example for this webinar is that I want to organize all this content around SharePoint events. So I have this document library called SharePoint Events, and this is the modern document library experience. So that's something to be aware of. You can still, the classic library experience is still supported. If I clicked on this, it would turn it back into that. And manage metadata is going to be useful for both classic and the modern document library experience. But really, if as much as you can, you want to plan everything around the modern document library experience. They're adding new features to it. Once everything from the classic experience is supported, the classic experience will eventually go away. And the modern document library experience actually has a lot of cool new features around tagging. So we have our documents set up, and you can see there are a few columns set up, and these are all managed metadata columns, and I'll show you how to create one in a second. But what you'll notice is here's conference location. These columns are all populated with values from the taxonomies that are in the term stores. So if I want to add a document, I'm just going to do a drag. And now I have a new document, and you can see it's not populated. In the classic experience, I would need to choose it. I can still do that and go to Edit Properties. But what's great about the modern experience is I can actually open up an information pane. That's up here, a details pane. And that's going to give me a quick view of this document, as well as my metadata fields. So instead of opening up the properties pane, or the edit like before, I can actually just click right here, this conference location. And I'm the conference organizer now, and oh yeah, that's right, it's in Minneapolis, so I'm going to type that in. And what you'll see, I begin to type, and it's suggesting from the taxonomy. And it's telling me that Minneapolis is recognized, but the preferred term is Twin Cities. So that's the benefit of, again, of synonyms, those other labels. It's making sure people are using that same construct that you've defined. I can still do type ahead. I can also click on this tag and browse through the taxonomy if I want. And you can see the hierarchy, call for speakers. So with the information pane, it's significantly easier and faster to begin to do the tagging of the documents, which is really nice. But you can see that the defined values help guide the user to kind of what the type of tag you're looking for. So that's also extremely helpful. So now we have tagged that document. You can tag, again, using the information pane. I can still, if I want to, come to properties. Again, that's bring another window. You can see how that properties pane is significantly more convenient. The last thing I can do is I can do a quick edit view. And that's going to allow me to edit metadata for all the items in my list. So if you don't want to go through items one by one, we can do it this way. You can drag and drop values down. So if you're starting a new library and there's a lot of things that you want to be tagging, this might be a view to do it a little bit more quickly. So we have our existing columns, but I want to actually add a new column. So the old way to do that in the classic experience would be up in the library. I could go to add a new column, but in the modern library experience, I'm just going to hit this plus. And I can choose my column type. Manage, the one I want to use taxonomies is manage metadata, which is not one of the top choices. So I'm going to come down here to more. And I'm going to call this audience level. And I'm going to choose manage metadata as my column type. And I can decide, is it a required column? Do I enforce a unique values? Do I allow multiple values? What I'm going to do is leave those, but then I'm going to come in, and what you'll see down here is there's a little window into the term store where we created those taxonomies. I'm going to come into webinars, and I'm going to choose my content audience term set. That's one I created earlier that has the 5 different levels. So I can tag this event by who's the audience that I'm targeting. And I'm going to save it. And now I have a brand new column. When I come back to the properties pane, we're going to see this new field, and those options from the taxonomy are now available to me. So I can save that. I'm going to unselect, do a quick edit. These ones are advanced. This is an intermediate. Expert, etc. So I can do all my tagging that way. I can close my quick edit. Now I have a few of these tagged. What I can also do is, if I don't want to see it in a list, I can view items as tiles. And I can actually arrange the items by one of these metadata values. So if I want to arrange it, I want to group them by audience level. In this tile view, You can see most are unassigned, but now that they're tiles, I can actually there's Santa. I think I screwed that up, but I can actually drag and drop these between. So I can drag this from empty over to advanced. So that's a good view if you're going to be sorting. How do I get rid of that empty? Here we go. So I have a few. If I want to, I'd say, oh, this one's not actually advanced, it's basic. I can move it down like that. So that's kind of a fun way, as much as tagging can ever be fun, way to tag documents. It's not going to be great if you have a huge list of terms, but if you want to quickly sort between 5 groupings like this, that can kind of be a nice way to go. Go back to all documents and list. So now we have this content, and we've tagged documents. Now, how is a user actually going to use it? What's the value to them? And we can get value right away right here within this library by going to the filter pane. And this is a new pane in the modern experience, and it's going to be providing you filters from your taxonomies. Actually, there's 3 ways these filters show up. The first is that if you have managed navigation or these filters set up in your classic experience, those columns will be enabled as filters in the modern experience automatically. The second way is that Microsoft apparently has some AI that will sort of suggest, it'll assume or learn which columns are most important and add those as filters. But if we don't trust the AI or we would just want to customize something ourselves, you can see that event is not included on this list. We just choose this drop-down, go to column settings, and we pin it to the filter pane. And now that's available. And it's great. You can actually combine these filters. So I have all these items in SharePoint, but I can say I'm just interested in call for speakers, and I only care about SharePoint Fest. And now I have the 3 documents. So that metadata is very powerful for taking big lists within a library and quickly narrowing it down to what the user actually wants to see. It's really a similar experience to doing iTunes. I don't want to see all 5,000 songs I have. I'm only interested in songs by Pearl Jam or the Grateful Dead or whatever it might be. So I can use those filters and narrow the list by the band, by the specific album, by genre, things like that. That's what the metadata is enabling somebody to do in a document library. So if you're talking about it internally, hey, we can provide an iTunes-like experience to our users to get through the documents. And you'll see that these filters actually do take advantage of the hierarchy as well. So clicking this, oh, now I'm only seeing things that are in North America, including the narrower terms. So that's the kind of the quick and dirty on how we're going to tag documents, how you're going to create a new column and assign a taxonomy that you've already created to that column so that people can populate it with that taxonomy, and then how you're going to be able to use the taxonomy to filter content within that library. But a lot of people may not want to filter within a library, they just may want to search. So let's take a look at how it's going to be benefited, how metadata is going to benefit the search. And this is a before search. So this is the default search in SharePoint, and I'm just going to do a search for SharePoint. And what you'll see is that we have the 3 default refiners, and they're all administrative metadata values: modify date, author, and result type. So I can narrow down, but am I really looking for team site or anything written by Mark Lair? That's probably not always how I'd like to filter. So once we have metadata values, we can set up the refiner web part and have it index the columns that we set up. So now the very same search, still these administrative values, they may be useful, but what's really interesting is the descriptive metadata values up here. So I've done a search. I'm interested in call for speakers. And what you'll see when I clicked on that the other filters dynamically updated to only include filters that are relevant to the result list. So again, you can combine those filters, and we're able to quickly get from, it was originally 375 results down to 8, down to 2 with just a few clicks. So that's the real power of metadata. You can imagine your users still, you're not going to be able to train your users to do advanced Boolean searches and really drill into the right result. But give them the tools that improve the keyword search that they're already doing and allow them to sort of do an intuitive left-hand filter search, just like they'd see on Amazon, just like they might see if Google's providing search refiners, etc. That gets people to the content that they're interested in. And that's all driven by a common vocabulary, by a taxonomy. So like I said, I was going to do that concludes the SharePoint demo. I'm going to do a quick demonstration of the WAN taxonomy library portal. I'm going to keep it to 30 seconds. Then we'll conclude with a few slides. And then get to Q&A. But the WAN taxonomy library portal is basically a venue where you can download taxonomies to jumpstart your own taxonomy project. So we have the list of the taxonomies that WAN has developed. You can click on a taxonomy, fleet management. And this is just a browsing interface, so I can see what sort of taxonomy content. Is this relevant to what my business needs or what I want to start with? If it is, come to Downloads, choose SharePoint, and this is going to request a download in the SharePoint Term Store format. So I can take this fleet operations taxonomy, request an extract in SharePoint, it's going to generate that export for me. And now the set of taxonomies that I have set up, I'm just going to grab this project management one. It's going to provide me a zip folder. Now here's this taxonomy in SharePoint Term Store format. So it's that easy to get a taxonomy that you can start with. I'm going to save it to my desktop. And now if I come back to the term store, all I have to do is right-click on a term group, import a term set, and just navigate to that CSV file. So it's that easy to start. Now I have a project management taxonomy that I can customize. So that's the value that WAN brings with the WAN taxonomy portal, is to speed up the process of creating these taxonomies so you can enjoy the benefits of easier tagging and findability, et cetera, that we've spent most of the webinar talking about. With that, like I said, I was going to keep that short. We'll go back to the slides. So to wrap up, how would you get started? First thing, you need to build your taxonomy. So building your term set. The business user should be involved when you're doing this, but I wouldn't throw it on their laps. I think it's better to engage them to get their input. but have a separate group building the taxonomies. But talk to the end users and try to understand, how do they want to search for information? What keywords or tags are important to them? What types of terms do they use? What types of documents do people call them on the phone and ask to find? That's going to help tell you what's important to have in your term sets. You may want to look at your site architecture as well. If you have a discrete library of HR terms, it may be valid, it may be a good idea to have an HR taxonomy to tag with, et cetera, et cetera. Start with that SharePoint CSV format if possible. Don't intimidate your end users with the term store. They'll get confused. What's that option? What's that button? Everyone's familiar with Excel. Edit it in Excel. You can make big changes. You can share that Excel sheet. Once it's done, then you're going to bring it into the term store, and that's where the editing is going to take place. Last kind of, these are all just kind of quick thoughts. Don't try to build one giant taxonomy. It's extremely overwhelming to think of, how do I build a taxonomy for XYZ Corp, one taxonomy. You don't have to. You saw that you can have multiple groups and term sets, and that a discrete term set may just apply to one library. So try to figure out what term sets do we need and break it down into a digestible project that way. Again, use that template. This is going to be more familiar for the folks and easier for the business users to give that feedback. They'll say, oh yeah, we need policies, delete this, change that name, etc. Again, the WAN Taxonomy Library Portal is a resource to speed it up, so you're not creating from scratch. Your business users can instead help you edit an existing taxonomy that's been proven. Last, before we get to the Q&A, ongoing governance. Do think about governance. Taxonomy management should be part of your SharePoint governance plan. Taxonomies change over time. It's not something you have to do 8 hours a day, but have a process of once a month or once a quarter looking at the enterprise keywords, looking at hashtags, looking at new term requests. Have a few policies around, when do we create a new term? Do we have definitions? Do we reuse or copy or pin terms? Something simple like term naming conventions, and making sure that you're always using and instead of ampersand or vice versa, and having a common capitalization structure so that when someone looks at the taxonomy, it kind of passes that sniff test of, yeah, this is consistent and some thought has gone into this. And then just make sure, the ongoing change management planning, putting those things in place up front is going to make sure your taxonomy is still working for you 2, 3, 4 years down the road. And with that, I'm always a little talkative, so we're almost at the end of the hour, but we do have some time for a few questions. And I'm going to pop out now. And I'm going to answer a few. Like I said, the ones I did not answer, I'll put answers in writing to all of them. The last thing I'll note before I get to the questions, if you are leaving, there is a survey, a post-webinar survey. We appreciate you filling it out. We appreciate the feedback. And if you do want to talk further, you'll have the option to request a contact there. So the first question I'm going to answer is one I got in advance via email, and he was asking about how are the refiners set up, and I'll sort of answer this more specifically in writing. But are the refiners based on the taxonomy, or is it based on a column? So he was wondering if you want to be able to refine a search by document type. Do you just have a document type taxonomy with the various group divisions underneath, like administration or finance? And the answer is, when the refiners in the search are set up, it's actually those refiners are indexing a column in a library. It's not indexing the taxonomy. So the difference in the refiners on the search is you didn't see the hierarchy. That's because it's just indexing the tags. The filters in the library are driven by the taxonomy, but the refiners in search are not. So if you're searching for finance and you've set up the refiners, only tags or only refiners from columns in the finance library are going to show up. You won't be able to refine based on HR, etc. If you have documents from both libraries that come back in a result, you'll see the HR refiners and the finance refiners as kind of two separate options for the user. So just keep that in mind when you're doing search refiners. Search refiners are driven by columns, not by taxonomies, which is a little bit, can be a little bit counterintuitive. Next question, can you point to some resources that describe the hybrid term store setup process? I'll make sure to send out some links after in the answers that talk through that. You should, if you have a hybrid instance of SharePoint, you should really be on top of things like hybrid taxonomy and other hybrid search and other things that they are rolling out, because it can make your experience a lot more unified and smoother. And Microsoft does a great job in their announcements to link to TechNets, etc. So I'll send those links out, but definitely keep on top of that. Here's a question, orphan terms. What are orphan terms? And orphan terms, that was a good eye to spot that. That was a group next to the hashtags and the keywords in the term store. Orphan terms are basically created when you may delete a taxonomy or delete a branch, or delete a term, I should say, that has narrower terms. If you can think of a taxonomy tree in the context of a family tree with children and parent terms, what happens if you get rid of a parent term? Well, now you have some orphans. So the orphans go into that group, and that would be a good way to, it's a good idea to keep an eye on those to either decide, do I need to give the orphan a new home, or do I need to just get rid of those terms? So kind of part of the governance. And I'm just looking for one more good question, and then we will wrap up, and I'll answer the rest in writing. Oh, here's actually a great question. What if an end user searches for St. Paul instead of Twin Cities in the search? So that is, I think, one of the more confusing things about the SharePoint synonyms is that the SharePoint synonyms do not go into the SharePoint search. So if somebody searched for St. Paul instead of Twin Cities, it's not going to use that synonym for query expansion purposes. So there's two solutions to that, depending on if you're on-premise or in the cloud. If you're on-premise, there is a thesaurus capability. So you can maintain a thesaurus file and add it to the SharePoint search and associate St. Paul as a synonym to Twin Cities. And then if somebody did a search for St. Paul or for Twin Cities, it would do a query expansion and look for both concepts and return all the results. So that's the on-premise. The in the cloud, SharePoint 365 does not have that thesaurus capability. So it becomes a little bit of a trickier way to tackle it. And I'll include some links in the written answer. You are able, I think, to fake the thesaurus by managing a SharePoint list and doing some things with the search. I won't be able to explain that well in the next couple minutes, so I'll include a link to that and get you the answer there. But just to emphasize, the thesaurus is not driven by the term store. And one last question that actually goes along with it: can you generate the thesaurus from the taxonomies in the term store? Unfortunately, you can't do that. So you would need to maintain the list separately when you develop your taxonomies. The good news from the One Taxonomy Library portal is we do provide a separate file of synonyms with their download, and that can be used as the basis for the thesaurus file. But just something to keep in mind when we're creating your taxonomies, and that's, again, another good reason to have governance in place so that, okay, we created a synonym, do we need to add it to the thesaurus file, yes or no, those types of things. So I want to thank everybody for your time today. Apologies for going over, but let's wrap it up. I will be sending out a link to the recording and answers to all the webinar questions, you should get that in the next day or two. I actually get it tomorrow. Please do, we really appreciate if you give any feedback on the post-webinar survey. And if you need any help or you'd like to talk to Juan about how we can assist with your SharePoint taxonomy project, please do reach out. With that, thank you very much again for your time today, and that will conclude our webinar.